Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're very, very privileged indeed to have with us today Dean Amaney Jamal. She's the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, the Edward S. Sanford Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Dean Jamal is a scholar of Middle Eastern politics and specializes in democratization and civic engagement in the Arab world, as well as the Muslim and Arab civic engagement in the US. Today, she will be speaking to us about public opinion in Palestine before the conflict. Dean Jamal, over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, Ali and my colleague Atif, who I'm not sure if he's there, but all of you who invited me. It's a great pleasure and honor, and hopefully soon I'll be able to make the visit in person, as it's a place that I have not visited yet. And I would love to be with you all in Pakistan. So thank you for having me. Today, I was asked to talk about our public opinion work in the Middle East. As you all know, I'm the co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer Project. And the Arab Barometer Project tracks public opinion data in the Middle East. So today's talk is public opinion in Palestine before the October 7th attacks, findings from the Arab Barometer Wave 8. So this is our 8th wave. And just very quickly, before I give you a deeper description of the Arab Barometer, we were surveying in the field up until October 7th in Palestine. We had about 10 interviews scheduled for October the 7th, but when the unfortunate attacks happened, we had to withdraw our teams. So we have data up until October 7th. So we have a good sense of what Palestinians were thinking in Gaza and the West Bank before this cycle of violence. So a word about the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer is a nonpartisan research network that provides insight into the social, political, and economic attitudes and values of ordinary citizens across the Arab world. The Arab Barometer is the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on ordinary citizen views in MENA. If you haven't visited our website, please do, www.arabbarometer.org. We have an English website and an Arabic website. We have all the data is publicly available. You can download it, and we have a portal where you can conduct simple analysis as well. And the Arab Barometer's mission is to track attitudes and behavior, build institutional capacity, disseminate knowledge about ordinary citizens living in MENA. To date, we've conducted more than 125,000 interviews. We've conducted 89 nationally representative samples, 8 waves across 16 countries, providing trend data on how views have changed across time. We have disaggregated data. Our disaggregated data allows for both inter and intra-country comparisons. That's our website, the arabbarometer.org, and country and topical reports are also available in English and Arabic on our website. So this particular survey in Palestine, this is a representative survey of 1,189 Palestinians. It was supposed to be 1,200, but as I mentioned, there's about 10 or 11 interviews we could not conduct because of the cycle of violence. And we interviewed Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, ages 18 and above. All our interviews are face-to-face in the respondent's place of residence. We rely on area probability samples, complex survey design stratified by governorate and urbanity. And we fielded from September 28 to October 8, 2023. And the fieldwork is conducted by our partner, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. So what do we know about the Arab-Israeli conflict? How do Palestinians view the Arab-Israeli conflict? And as you know, before the cycle of violence, Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to embark on a normalization agreement that would have enhanced Israel and Saudi Arabia's security and economic relationships, but there was really no mention of the Palestinians in that normalization agreement. So when we ask Palestinians, what are your views of normalization between Arab states and Israel, you'll see here 68% strongly opposed, 25% opposed, only 7% favor. The idea is that the Palestinians don't want to be left out of the equation. They view normalization without addressing the Palestinian conflict as a means of basically skipping it and keeping it as keeping it as the status quo, which is a people and population living under Israeli occupation. And you'll see here that even in Gaza, the the opposition slightly higher here, but nevertheless in the West Bank there's very strong opposition. So across the board, 90% plus of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza oppose normalization. When we ask Palestinians, for all the talk about Palestinians wanting to destroy the state of Israel, when we ask Palestinians, of the following three options, which is the most favored option? A two-state solution based on 1967 borders, one-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis live together in one state, or a confederation. We also allowed for a fourth option, which is other, and most people wrote in armed resistance in other. You'll see that across the board, the majority still favor a two-state solution where Palestinians can live side by side with the state of Israel. And when we break this down by Gaza and the West Bank, you don't find much difference. So about a strong plurality or even majority support a two-state solution. You'll see in the West Bank, there's slightly a little bit more support for armed resistance. In a new poll that came out by our partner, which was not part of the Arab Barometer like 2 weeks ago, you'll also see that this number has now increased since the cycle of violence, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. It's important for us to sort of think about who the Palestinians view as a neutral or at least supportive international partner to help resolve this conflict. So we asked Palestinians to support, their opinions about the role of China in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we basically said, which of the countries do you believe is better, the US or China, when it comes to addressing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? What you'll see is that the majority or the plurality says China is better. Only 13% say the US is better. 37% say both are equally bad. So it does though indicate that China has an edge over the United States in terms of which country's seen as better able to address the conflict. And if you've looked at what's happened since the conflict, China has really stepped up to call for a two-state solution and an end of violence in ways that the United States is sort of going back and forth on. Economic conditions in the West Bank and Gaza. This is very important for us to sort of understand what was the economic situation, especially in Gaza, before the cycle of violence. Current economic situation in the country, meaning West Bank and Gaza, only 19% say very good or good, 37% say bad, 43% say very bad. Now look at Gaza here, which is the light beige. 55% say very bad, 38% say bad. So only 6% of Gazans said it was good. 94% said the economic situation, 93% said the economic situation was bad or very bad. This is the 2.4 million people living in the Gaza Strip, the most highly densely populated area in the world. When we think about economic optimism, do you think your situation will improve in the next 2 to 3 years? The idea is there room for upward mobility? Is there room for a better economic future? You'll see that here we break it down. The pooled data say basically 24% say it's going to be somewhat worse, 32% say much worse. And so that's the majority of Palestinians believing their economic situations will be much worse in the 2 to 3 years to come. Now, again, this is all before the cycle of violence. Most important challenge facing the country, the economic situation is the most important, 129%. Corruption is 18%. Now, again, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are ruled by their governing authorities. In the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas. In Gaza, you had the Hamas government. Among both populations, and you'll see this, there's a rising belief that among the ranks of Hamas in Gaza and among the ranks of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, there is growing levels of corruption. Political instability is another very important challenge. But look, in Gaza, 41% say the economic situation is the most egregious issue. Again, this is a population, you'll see some more data in a bit, but this is a population that was economically struggling before this crisis. And yesterday, a report, or the day before yesterday, a report came out that said 9 out of 10 Gazans under the current bombardment of the state of Israel, 9 out of 10 Gazans are struggling to find food to eat right now. So that's just a horrendous statistic. Corruption, again, as I was mentioning, corruption in state agencies in the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas regime. About 31% said there is corruption, that it's very prevalent. 31% said to a medium extent. 54% said to a large extent. But that's the vast majority of people believe that the corruption is widespread. And you'll see that the opinion is even stronger in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas's government. Tackling corruption, are the governments trying to tackle the corruption? You'll see that the majority don't believe that the governments are really trying to address it. 37% say not at all. 24% say to a small extent. And you see that this is sort of even more strongly, again, prevalent, this opinion in the West Bank than Gaza. Now, the availability of food. This is our food security question. Is the availability of food is it currently a problem for your household? 34% said yes, to a great extent. This is the pooled data between the West Bank and Gaza. Another 34% said to a medium extent. That's 68%. That's 2/3 of the Palestinian people saying that the availability of food is a problem. But when we look at Gaza, it's far more overwhelming. Almost 47% say it's a problem to a great extent, with another 31% saying it's to a medium extent. So this is, again, all before the October 7th cycle of violence. Food insecurity. The food that we bought did not last, and we did not have money to get more in the previous 30 days. 17% of Palestinians said it's often true. 41% said sometimes true. And then 42% said never true. But when we look at Gaza versus the West Bank, you'll see that 75% said it was often true or sometimes true. This is in Gaza. And this is important because we conduct our surveys every 2 years. This is 2023. In 2021, only 51% said they could not find food, or that the food was not enough in the previous 30 days. So we've seen an increase from 2021 to 2023 of almost 25%. That's another quarter of the population. And remember, 2021 is in the middle of the pandemic, where you had food shocks, food prices, shut down. So the economy was already struggling in 2021. In the last 2 years, things have gotten progressively worse in Gaza for the average Gazan. And you'll see here in the West Bank Palestinians enjoy slightly better quality of life and economic well-being. 53% of West Bankers say it's never true. Political conditions. So a lot of what's been happening, especially with the violent campaign against the people in Gaza, is that, well, Gazans elected Hamas, and therefore Gazans, it's fair to punish all the population of Gaza because they elected Hamas. First of all, the elections were in 2006. That means the elections were almost 20 years ago. Do you know that 50% of Gaza was not even born in 2006? So you have another 50% of the population today of Gaza being held accountable. These are the children in Gaza, for an election that happened in 2006. Second, in 2006, Hamas didn't win this overwhelming majority. Hamas was far more disciplined in terms of the number of candidates it ran per district. Hamas only secured 44% of the popular vote, but because they ran 1 or 2 candidates in each district, while Fatah, the Mahmoud Abbas political party, ran 8 candidates in a district, Fatah diluted its own votes for a winner-take-all type of formula. So Hamas won many districts, and that's how it won 44% of the popular vote. It ended up with almost 70% of seats in parliament. But even the third point on that election is that most Palestinians who voted for Hamas in that 2006 election, it had nothing to do with the peace process. It was more about voting against the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. So you had entire Christian villages in the West Bank vote for Hamas in 2006. It's unprecedented that Christian villages would vote for an Islamic political party, but they were voting for the Islamic political party to check Hamas's check Palestinian authorities' growing levels of corruption. So, in our survey, we asked how much trust is there in the government in the West Bank and Gaza? You'll see in the West Bank, when we ask Palestinians, 2% say a great deal of trust, 16% say quite a lot of trust, 19% say not a lot of trust, and 57% of West Bankers say no trust at all. So look at here, you have almost close to 80, 70, 76% of Palestinians in the West Bank saying they have no trust in their governing authority. We almost see a very similar story about the Hamas government in Gaza. About 67% here say they do not have not a lot of trust or no trust at all in the Hamas government. That's 2/3 of the Palestinian population. So what we see in Gaza before the cycle of violence, levels of trust in Hamas are falling. Economic conditions are deteriorating very rapidly for the average Palestinian in Gaza. Government responsiveness. Do you believe the government is responsive? In the pooled data, about 20% say very or largely responsive, but another about almost 80% say not very responsive or not responsive at all. And you see that these numbers are very comparable across the West Bank and Gaza. Trust in Hamas. Do you trust the Hamas? You'll see the pooled data is not a lot of trust or no trust at all. Trust in Hamas in Gaza, you'll see that 66% say not a lot of trust or no trust at all in Gaza. So that's again another 2/3. In the West Bank, that number was much higher. There was no trust, but this new poll I was telling you about, and I hope to answer more questions about it, now shows that in the West Bank, after the 70 days of violence, trust in Hamas is very, very, very high. It's over 50% right now. Almost close to 70% in the West Bank right now. Trust in Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas, this is the big problem also in the Palestinian scene. Mahmoud Abbas has been the leader of the Palestinian National Authority since 2006. We have not seen another election in Palestine since. There's not a lot of trust, no trust at all, 17%, 56%. That's almost close to 73%. And then you see trust in the president across Gaza and the West Bank. Again, there's not a lot of trust even in Gaza for Mahmoud Abbas. So this is the problem. Why is this a problem? Because when people are sort of talking about, well, what's going to happen in the day after, if Hamas is eliminated, which it doesn't look like we're not sure about what that outcome is going to look like. It's not like the Palestinian Authority has much legitimacy and trust among the Palestinian people to govern Gaza to begin with. Party affiliation, we try to figure out, like, our people, the two key parties in the Palestinian landscape is Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas's party, and Hamas. About 30% of Palestinians say they support Fatah, 21% say Hamas. In the West Bank and Gaza, you find that this is sort of breaking down. Fatah support in the West Bank and Gaza is comparable, but look, in Gaza, you still do have a little bit of more significant support in Hamas. But 27% say they support Hamas. In the West Bank, it was 17%, but again, this is now much higher because of the cycle of violence. Freedom of speech guaranteed, again, for all the talk about Palestinians supporting Hamas in Gaza, even before this whole cycle of violence, most Palestinians said they do not have the freedom to express their opinions. The freedom to express your opinions is not guaranteed at all or to a limited extent. That's the majority. That's 67% here say that. And you'll see that Palestinians in the West Bank increasingly feel that their freedom of expression is being hindered. But when we look at also Gaza, it's about 58% believe that their ability to freely express their opinion is not guaranteed. That's a majority. So for the talk about why don't Palestinians protest against Hamas, why haven't we seen Palestinians take out the Hamas government? There are no elections, there are no freedoms. there's repression. We also see this in terms of the freedom to participate in peaceful protests and demonstrations. Do you think the right to protest is guaranteed? Only 27% said it's guaranteed to a great extent, 6%, or to a medium extent, 21%. Again, the numbers are larger in the West Bank, who believe they can't peacefully protest. But in Gaza, look at it's about 68% believe that they cannot peacefully protest in Gaza. This is, again, right before the events. Freedom of press, a similar story. About 55% believe that the press does not have the freedoms across the two cases. And you see here, it's pretty comparable across the West Bank and Gaza, although in the West Bank, again, it's seen as more oppressed, slightly more oppressive. So very quickly, because I do want to allow for time for question and answer, how do Palestinians view the political landscape around them? One of the key questions that we get is how much support is there for Iran among Palestinians, especially because Hamas is allegedly aligned with Iran. So this is something that we're tracking in our public opinion data. So first of all, favorability of the United States. This is no surprise. Even before the cycle of violence, the U.S. enjoys very low levels of support among Palestinians. Only 19% said very favorable, 3%, or somewhat favorable, 16%. The majority do not view the United States favorably. We've seen a slight increase from 2021 to 2023 from 15 to 19% of favorability scores in the United States. Economic relations with the United States. To what extent would you like to see stronger economic relations with the United States? About 23% say stronger economic relations, 27% say stay the same, and then about 42% say they want weaker economic ties. Again, Palestinians don't support U.S. foreign policy as it pertains to the Palestinians, because the U.S. is often seen as allied with the state of Israel against the national aspirations of Palestinians. So this has been an ongoing issue. And you'll see from 2012 across the last decade, fewer and fewer Palestinians want economic relations with the United States. So a lot of people were attributing this to Donald Trump, but we don't see that Biden has much more popularity among the Palestinians even before the war. So American President Joe Biden's foreign policy, 27% say it's bad, 39% say it's very bad. That's close to 66%. American President Joe Biden's foreign policy toward MENA, is it the percent saying it's very good or good? In 2021, it was 11%. In 2023, it's still 11%. So it's not like Biden has won people's hearts in the region, in Palestine. And then what you see is China's favorability is on the rise among Palestinians. The percent saying that they view this country very favorably or somewhat favorably, that's about 34%. And if we are comparing it across time, you'll see that in 2021 it was 34%. In 2023, in this more recent survey, it is at 43%. So that's good. I think this one is a 10% here. I apologize about that. And then economic relations with China, you'll see they were high in 2019. About 49% want stronger economic relations with China. In 2023, it's 44%. But the big reference point is this: 23% in 2023 with the United States. Now China's at 44%. So almost double the amount of Palestinians want stronger ties with China than they do economic ties with China than they do with the United States. Xi's favorability, president of China, you'll see his favorability has also surged from 18% to 27% across the last 2 years. Again, compared to Biden, that's 11%. So these are sort of like the relevant statistics. Russia is pretty static, but still Russia enjoys more popularity in Palestine than does the United States. Favorability of Russia between 2021 is at 27%, in 2023 is at 29%. Economic relations with Russia it's static from 2016 onwards, about 31% to 29%. But again, the relative statistic is comparing Russia to China, 44%, to the United States, 23%. So China still has the edge over both Russia and the United States. And you note that China's economic policies and foreign economic policies have gradually been increasing their economic ties in the Middle East. So why is this important? Because there is always the debate about, will China be the next sort of superpower in the Middle East? And then when we look at Putin's foreign policy towards MENA, it's about 19% in 2019 think it's good or very good. And then in 2023, that is closer to 23%. We have some questions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to skip those just to look at the favorability of Saudi Arabia. What we see is that Saudi Arabia has also been gaining in popularity among the Palestinians. In 2021, it was 24%. In 2023, it is 38%. Now, arguably, the Palestinian Authority is often seen as more aligned with Saudi Arabia and sort of like the Sunni powers in the region, while Hamas is more aligned to Russia, Iran, and China. So we see maybe a lot of this geopolitical situation playing out in the Palestinian territories as well. Economic relations with Saudi Arabia. After the Arab Spring, there was a lot of optimism that maybe the Arab world would become a little bit more economically independent. As we know from previous work that I've done, the Middle East is the most economically dependent region on the United States and across the world. Even though, despite the oil, despite all the the advantages of oil, still when we look at different indicators, the Middle East remains the most economically dependent region. And so after the Arab Spring, you saw that Palestinians were hoping that they would have stronger economic relations with Saudi Arabia, maybe as a means of sort of becoming more autonomous. That has gradually fallen across the last decade, but in 2023, still 39% said they want stronger relations with the economic relations with Saudi Arabia. Is MBS favorable? You'll see that his popularity actually is growing. From 2021, 13% said the economic, his foreign policies towards MENA is good or very good. Today, that was closer to 25%. Iran favorability, about a third of Palestinians say that they have very favorable or somewhat favorable views of Iran. 30% in 2021, 28% in 2023. And economic relations with China, again, at the eve of the Arab Spring, we sort of see that there was more excitement about economic relations with other Middle Eastern partners, but that's been on the decline. Only a quarter in 2023 say they want stronger economic relations with Iran. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's foreign policy towards MENA, you'll see that this is gradually on the rise. 21% believe his foreign policies are very good or good in 2023. In this more recent poll that I was citing that was conducted by our partner about 2 weeks ago, support for Khamenei has increased drastically also among Palestinians right now. And that's seen as, like, again, playing out with the support for Hamas. Favorability of Turkey. Turkey remains very popular among Palestinians. About 57% view this country favorably. And you'll see that this number has declined gradually, but nevertheless is still enjoying some support. This number is, if we take out the don't knows, it grows sort of to 65%. So I apologize about the discrepancy here. Economic relations with Turkey, 51% want stronger economic relations with Turkey. That's probably the highest in terms of the number one country. It's Turkey, then China, then the rest. Erdogan's favorability he's still pretty popular at 56% in 2023. Qatari favorability, as you all know, Qatar has housed Hamas until very recently, and has also supported Gaza. Qatar remains extremely favorable among the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians of Gaza. So if you look at this in terms of those people in Gaza who believe that they're very favorably predisposed to Qatar or somewhat favorable, that number is close to 89%. Sorry, 79%. So again, those are huge numbers for Qatar. And then Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed. You'll see it's kind of just, about a quarter think it's very good. 50, close to 45% believe it's bad or very bad. The numbers are sort of comparable to Saudi Arabia still enjoys a little bit more popularity than the Emirate president here. And with that wraps up my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A session. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed for a very insightful talk. And just before I open up to everybody, may I ask you to speak a little bit more about the poll that you were talking about that's been conducted now after 70 days of violence? Are there more insights you'd like to share from that?
Yes, sorry about that. Just getting my volume adjusted. Yeah, so what happened is our partner, because there were so many questions about, well, what happens to support for Hamas? What happens to support for the PA after these cycles of violence? So what we know historically is that anytime there's a cycle of violence between Hamas and Israel, it bodes well for Hamas's popularity. So we anticipate and we suspect that support for Hamas will grow after this cycle of violence. But also we've been cautioning, we have never seen this level of devastation in Gaza. So when we hear what people are saying, especially the 1.8 million Palestinians who have been displaced and are basically in the southern part of Gaza, there is now some anger against Hamas among Gazans. So at least qualitatively, what we're hearing is that people sort of are questioning whether what Hamas did was prudent, whether what it was well thought out, because there's this real concern now that not only the humanitarian devastation in Gaza, upwards of 20,000 people have been killed, 1.8 million people have been displaced. There's still worries that if Egypt opens the border, you're going to have another Nakba, another 1948, 1967. So what is Hamas's popularity looking like? So our partner went back and conducted a survey 2 weeks ago. Now, he conducted it both in the West Bank and Gaza. The problem with Gaza, we rely on area probability sampling because we have very good census data of Gaza, so we can sample so that it's a representative sample in Gaza. With the displacement, it was a random sample of all displaced people, right? So how representative is it is still a question mark. So Gaza, what we found in that new poll, or what our partner found, is 50% of Gaza still supports Hamas. That is higher than the 33% that we found right before the incident. So we've seen some increased support in Gaza. More overwhelmingly, the West Bank, which is always seen as a strong base of support for the Fatah party and for Mahmoud Abbas, although Mahmoud Abbas is not popular, but nevertheless for the Fatah party, what we've seen is that while support for Hamas was closer to 20-25%, it's now above 75%. And support for armed resistance among West Bank Palestinians has also increased. So this also is a problem right now because it's going to pit the Palestinian Authority against Hamas in the West Bank. Now remember, Hamas in Gaza called for Hamas West Bank to join in the attacks on Israel. Hamas West Bank has not joined. And some are arguing Hamas West Bank is playing a low-key role right now because it sees itself as vying with Fatah for political leadership of the West Bank. Now, bigger picture, we know that Israel, the Arab world, and the international community will not deal with Hamas. So that creates another wrinkle in the equation now.
Thank you very much. Any questions, Chima Saab, please?
Sorry, the sun is coming. I'm trying to block it this morning. We've had rain, nothing but rain for the last 3 days, and now the sun came out. So I apologize.
No problem.
Hi, Dean Jamal. This is Ali. I first of all wanted to thank you for giving this talk. But I was kind of wondering in some sense, although perhaps there aren't sort of poll questions on this, but what's the view about international law? I mean, from where I'm sitting, I think in some sense international law and the protection it's supposed to give is dead. And if international law in the eyes of the people unravel, then in some sense the results of the new poll make sense, because the only thing to protect myself is resistance in some sense. So, I mean, there is the bigger question around the politics of American action or Israeli action, but I think there's a deeper question of what are law or justice-based mechanisms that can provide protection to people which are so violently being displaced and killed, and how that would influence the future of their trust in anything that can rebuild from here.
Yes. So this is a great question, Ali. Thank you for your question. So this is sort of the deep pain, the deep sense of dehumanization that ordinary Palestinians carry day in and day out, which is that you have an international law regime, you have humanitarian laws, you have European countries talking about the importance of humanitarian laws, and the United States, but these laws stop at the doorstep of Palestinians. When it comes to Palestinians, all of a sudden, humanitarian law doesn't apply. So this is a big problem, and this is why those of us who have often advocated for a two-state solution designed by international law have believed that if international laws truly dignified the average Palestinian's life and humanizes the average Palestinian, then international law will gain even more credence and legitimacy among Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims more generally, right? The way this is playing out, I mean, it's not even devoid of U.S. geostrategic interests in the Middle East, but also of what's perceived as widespread Islamophobia, right? So, think about things like the debate about free speech in Europe. When the debate about free speech in Europe is about humiliating Muslims, it's free speech. But when the debate about freedom of speech in Europe is about Palestinian supporters expressing their rights, it's no longer allowed. It's criminalized. So there's these norms, these laws of humanitarianism and freedom of speech and civil liberties seem to apply to just a group and category of people, but systematically are being denied to Palestinians or Muslims more generally. And this is a deep source of grievance for Muslims. In terms of the Palestinians, it's just right now, I mean, clearly international law has its limits. It's not protecting Palestinian civilians. Clearly the laws of war are not protecting Palestinian civilians. UN resolution after UN resolution has been vetoed, right? To protect Palestinians, to call for a ceasefire, to ensure that there's humanitarian aid and assistance going in, to ensure that there isn't indiscriminate killing. Even the United States is calling it indiscriminate killing, but hasn't really been able to exercise any leverage with Israel. This discredits the whole sort of international law regimes. I mean, if the countries of the United Nations do not abide by these rules, right? It means that why should other countries abide by these rules? So it sets a very poor precedent for these groups. Now, again, I want to make sure I say, I think what Hamas did to Israelis is atrocious on October 7th, but taking out Hamas or dealing with Hamas is different than bombing an entire population across the board. And in my opinion, from what we're seeing in the public opinion data, this cycle of violence has done nothing but increase support for Hamas among Gazans, increased support for Hamas among West Bankers, delegitimated the two-state solution, is making armed resistance like the only attractive option. And that, to your point, Ali, the reason why, I mean, it's incumbent upon the international community, including Israel, to give Palestinians hope of a future that can be resolved peacefully. But if you've ruled out peace, and under the guise of the peace process, the West Bank shrunk, and there was no movement on the negotiations, right? At the beginning of the peace process in 2003, there were only 100,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. After 20 years of peacemaking, today there's 750,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. That means, and this is among a 2.5 million population. So almost a third now of the population on the West Bank is Israeli settlers. This happened while the Palestinians had denounced terrorism on the West Bank, recognized Israel's right to exist, have been wanting a two-state solution based on clear demarcated borders, clear recognition, clear dignity and safety and security for both peoples. So back to you, Ali. What other, I worry that this cycle of violence is making the likelihood of peace less likely and support for that peace less likely and increasing the favor of armed resistance.
Dean Jamal, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my name is Iram Heather. I'm a assistant professor at the College of Worcester in Ohio, and I'm just here for the conference. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I want to ask a question as somebody who's doing public opinion polls in a place where, to me, it's not like any other country where you can ask, what about accountability, right? So I'm very new to this region, so when they say that there's no trust or there's fears of corruption in the Fatah government, or if there's no trust in sort of the economic development or the economic process, how much of that are they laying at the feet of their elected, the 2006 elections, and how much of it is sort of an admission of circumstance as well, right? And the reason this is important is how can you credibly hold an elected government accountable if there haven't been elections in 20 years, and also you can see what constraints they themselves are working under. So to me, that's a crucial question for the kind of survey work that Afrobarometer is following in the footsteps of Latin Barometer and Africa Barometer and sort of the Arab Barometer now. They're designed on the assumption that these are sovereign states, and that the populations of these sovereign states then have the ability to hold their governments accountable. But Palestine is not a sovereign state. So how do you interpret these results, especially when it comes to things like corruption and economic development? Thank you.
That's a very good question. We get that question a lot, which is like, we know that these territories or the West Bank and Gaza are not necessarily independent sovereign entities. And so we're sort of asking questions as if you have these sovereign entities. So we do, for Palestine also, we do ask some questions about the Israeli occupation. And oftentimes, Palestinians will say, we used to be occupied by one power, which was Israel, but now we're occupied by two. And why is this important? It's not to criticize, we're not into sort of criticizing or saying that, well, the Palestinian plight relies on the governments of Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas to solve it. Because let's just be honest, right? Gaza is under economic blockade. Mahmoud Abbas has settlements being built all around his population, so they resent him because he was the whole project of the Palestinian Authority. It did not exist before 2003. The Palestinian Authority was created alongside Oslo to deliver the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And part of the creation of the Palestinian Authority in 2003, remember, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. Israel no longer wanted to occupy the West Bank and Gaza directly. What I mean by that, it was sick and tired of sending its military, its professional military, into the West Bank to sort of chase little kids throwing stones. So it gave that responsibility to the Palestinian Authority. There was security agreements, of course, Hamas also arrest dissent. In terms of the per capita security presence in the West Bank, I've read recently that the West Bank is one of the most securitized regions in the world in terms of per capita police or security presence within the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority. Remember, the Palestinian Authority was trained by the CIA, by the United States. You have these compounds in Jericho where the actual training, how to control and monitor and guarantee security so that the Palestinians in the West Bank remain compliant or at least do not agitate. So this was given to the Palestinian Authority, but in return, they should have gotten a state. But what happened is they became a governing, repressive security arm of the United States and Israel, and then they received no state. So the resentment of the people against the Palestinian Authority has only grown. Now, on Gaza, Hamas, too, is living under conditions of economic blockade, but it became a governing authority. And as it's trying to solidify its own rule, it also has become increasingly more authoritarian. But you can't ignore the big elephants in the room, which is economic blockade in Gaza, West Bank ongoing sort of occupation with the PA serving as the occupying arm of the Israeli government. So this is the dilemma. This is something that we talk about when we write our written reports. So we're keen on making sure that people don't see this as sovereign entities. But it also talks about the dilemma, right? Because the West Bank, and what we try to highlight is that the West Bank contract between Palestinians and the PA is very fragile. Actually, in the poll, our poll, close to 55% of Palestinians believe the Palestinian Authority is a burden on the Palestinian people, and they want it to dissolve. Which means they want to invite the Israeli occupation back because then they believe maybe international law will protect them, because Israel wants to treat the West Bank as sovereign when it's not sovereign. I don't know if that answers your question.
We have another question back here.
Thank you, Dean Jamal, for sharing a lot of data and insights. Changing gears and talking about what's happening on US campuses, very specifically with Liz McGill at UPenn resigning, and then Harvard president just making it through barely. And I think, the comment is that and then also lately in the past few days, some of the protests by students and on many US, or at least on a few US campuses were banned, which were going to support people in Gaza. And I think freedom of thought and expression was something that was a pride of US university campuses. And of course, generally in the US society. So given all of this, I guess two-part question: what's the mood of faculty? How does it affect the work they will be doing or the kind of questions they might be probing in the future? And secondly, the students who are raising their voices against indiscriminate killing in Gaza and the ban that I just mentioned, is that the new norm? Is it going to change a lot of how dialogue and dialogue about political movements and expression happens on US campuses? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. This is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, not only as like a Palestinian American and academic who works on the Middle East, but as a dean, and how do we sort of think about this in terms of our students across campuses and what does it mean? So I have a few observations. I'm going to try to be succinct. But first of all, in the United States in particular, it's always been difficult to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, right? It's always been so difficult that most people don't want to talk about it. So if you look at what's happened on our college campuses across the board, we have a vacuum. We have a vacuum in terms of who's educating about this topic, who's talking about it. These are courses that are not being taught anymore, because when we ask faculty to teach these courses, they say, no, I don't want to deal with this. It's a headache. No matter what I say, it's going to be wrong. So people choose not to teach this. I think this is a mistake, and this exemplifies the problem, which if professors feel they can't teach this course, we have to ask ourselves why, right? And so the issue is that this is such a polarized issue. And remember, we in the United States right now are a very polarized country. Like the levels of polarization and uncivil dialogue going on in this country is something that I've never seen in my entire career, right? It's just really horrendous. Of course, social media exacerbates this. Everybody talks in echo chambers, but we need to also start thinking about civic dialogue and how to sort of restore that on our college campuses. So I have a lot of observations. Third, I do believe that the students who are protesting, many of them were not even born in 2003 when the Oslo Accords were signed. So many of them don't even appreciate on both sides that we as Palestinians and Israelis, you don't have to support Oslo, but we as Palestinians and Israelis, we came very close to a peace treaty. I know it didn't advantage the Palestinians, but nevertheless, Palestinians and Israelis were working together. And so this history of what could have been, or about the cooperation that had happened, is missing also from the discourse of our students on both sides. So what is the discourse looking like among the student groups on campus? Is that there's only hatred between Israelis and Palestinians, and there's only hatred between Jews and Muslims. And this is nothing further from the truth. And let me step back again, another observation. When we used to talk about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which I oppose both and have worked against both of these as ills in our society, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because here's the issue. When we looked at public opinion data and studies in the US, the forces of anti-Semitism and the force of Islamophobia are the same sources. It's dominant majority hateful ideology. So if you pulled somebody who was Islamophobic, there's a very high probability that that same person is going to be anti-Semitic. And if you pulled somebody from the majority population who's anti-Semitic, it's a very high probability that they're going to be Islamophobic, meaning that as Jews and Muslims, we were on the same side of the Islamophobia anti-Semitism debate. So then what's happened now? Now you have a conflict. It's an Israeli-Palestinian political conflict. And this is why I spend a lot of time making sure that people understand that it's the political conflict that is creating tension, and not this ongoing hatred of Jews versus Muslims. Because we do see cohesion. At moments of calm, these communities can get along. So now back to the conflict. If it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what does this mean? First of all, it means, of course, pro-Palestinian students are going to be very, very impassioned, right? They've never seen this level of devastation in their entire lives. It means pro-Israeli students are going to be very impassioned about what's going on. They've never seen this level of devastation in Israel. So we have now groups that are very emotional, very angry. They want to hear from administrators that, yes, we recognize your rights. You have the right for free speech, for assembly. And we understand the humanity of both sides. Because we live in a political environment in the United States where Palestinians and pro-Palestinian groups are often dehumanized, it creates more anger among the pro-Palestinian students. But still, that anger is protected by free speech. But I have sort of talked to students across campuses and said, like, there's things that also structurally could have been handled better by universities. Like, make sure that the protests are not screaming at each other. Make sure that they're in their respective spaces. but better education about some of the slogans we're using, right? When the Palestinians say from the river to the sea, what do they really mean? Do they really mean the annihilation of the state of Israel? Or do they really mean that Palestinians within these boundaries need to be free? Intifada. Intifada, is that a call for mass genocide of Jews, or is Intifada uprising, non-violent uprising? Because the first Intifada in 1989 was non-violent resistance. So how did that become the genocide of the Jews and being used in Congress in the hearings with the university presidents? So that level of lack of sophistication about the history of the conflict itself has been surprising. But then finally, the last point, a big issue that we're going to have to grapple with, and the debate what's happening now is, does criticizing, let's say, for example, the Benjamin Netanyahu government or the Israeli government, does that qualify as anti-Semitism? Does criticizing Hamas or Mahmoud Abbas or the PA, does that constitute Islamophobia? So these are the debates that I think that are going to need to be fleshed out. Nevertheless, on our campuses, there's a lot of anger right now, especially because, again, going back to the initial point, the lack of humanization. We're in a country where in Congress, some representatives have said, well, all of Gazans are animals and deserve to be killed. So naturally, there's going to be a very emotional reaction to that among our student populations.
Any other questions? Just before we conclude, one last question, Dean Jamal. What would you like to share your views about the viability now of the two-state solution versus a one-state solution?
This is a very good question. Yesterday, I believe, here's what I believe. I believe that the peace camp, which was the majority of Palestinians and Israelis, the ones who wanted a two-state solution, are horrified by what's happening, because what we're seeing is that everything's sort of falling apart. On the Israeli front, you have the most right-wing Israeli government that we've ever seen. In its coalition, you have people who are calling for the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and Gaza. Like, let's just get rid of everybody. That's what we worry about, what's happening in Gaza right now. On the Palestinian side, Hamas has a lot of support. Hamas has since been talking about a two-state solution, but the question is it really sincere or not? The Palestinian Authority has typically been the two-state leadership. It's losing its support. So this is creating a dilemma. Yesterday in the New York Times, former national security advisors for the Obama administration, not the Islamophobic ones in New York City that were chasing the vendors. I don't know if you guys saw that. But the ones who were advising on the two-state solution came out in an editorial yesterday saying the United States should recognize a Palestinian state now. It needs to recognize Palestinian national aspirations, and this is the only way to get the peace process back on track. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but nevertheless, there are opportunities now if we want to sort of salvage this devastation and everything sort of, what you don't want is some sort of status quo where every 5 or 10 years, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, whatever, you're going to, we didn't talk about the strength of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis 20 years ago. And so if you think about where this conflict is going, if there's no peace, I worry that we're looking only at a future of the next group of characters coming out who are going to be armed and able with drones and this and that. Now, what we've seen from Gaza, if anything, I'm Palestinian and I study the conflict. We're still shocked, quite honestly, to see that under conditions of economic blockade, where you have the longest border with the state of Israel, the sea is monitored and blocked off, allegedly the border with Egypt is monitorized and securitized, that all these weapons are in Gaza under economic blockade. So even in 2014, with the last round of escalated violence, and then 2019, I believe, you didn't see these levels of drones and missiles and RPGs, and I don't know weapons very well, but like it's sophisticated stuff and it's huge. So the fact that all this stuff is in Gaza under satellite monitoring, drones, you know, people in Gaza often say when there's no sound of drones above the sky, they think something is wrong. Like it's a daily reality, the drones, the surveillance, and under all these conditions, these weapons are in Gaza. And so this does raise the question about like, well, what will the future look like if we don't try to get to peace with agreements, maybe some sort of demilitarized agreements, or at least peace treaties that hold different groups accountable, so this cycle of violence doesn't continue. Because honestly, like, you know, this time there's already about 20,000, 25,000 Palestinians killed. We don't know when this violence is going to stop. Israel has suffered major casualties on the military side and its own citizens with this October 7th attacks. I mean, violence only breeds violence. And if violence were going to solve this conflict, it would have been solved by now. Sorry, I know I went on with that.
No, thank you very much. It leaves me to thank you again for making time to speak to us. Many of us are very, very deeply invested, and we're very closely following what's happening. So thank you for your insights. And I want to thank the audience as well for staying and engaging with this talk. Thank you, Dean Jamal.
Thank you so much for having me. Inshallah, next time in person. So
Inshallah, next time in person. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.